Hi Legion, John Hittler, co-founder of Evoking Genius and co-creator of the Genius Discovery Process, with another edition of Pure Genius. Hey, we've all studied World War II, haven't we? Have you ever studied it from a different country's point of view? You study it from the US point of view, it looks like one way. If you look at it from the French point of view, or the Japanese, or the British, how about the Russian point of view? They lost 26 million men. In contrast, the US lost 250,000. You think the Russians might have a different story or history of World War II than the US does? A different perspective? Absolutely. Any story is different depending on the perspective you choose. How about you? You tell stories. You tell stories about yourself, you tell stories about your family or your upbringing or your advantages or your disadvantages or your looks or your talents or your intellect. And that story opens or closes possibilities, doesn't it? Here's the question for you. How is the story that you're telling about you and your life limiting what's possible? That's our topic today on Pure Genius. Now, I coach CEOs, entrepreneurs, team leaders, and individuals to create lasting behavior change by making transformation safer and more attractive than standing still. Here's the promise today. We're going to take your personal history and we're going to make it safer and more attractive for great possibilities to show up in your life. Want to play? It's a sensitive topic, and let's spin the big wheel. Well, like I said, you go back to World War II. Depending on which country you're talking about, the history of World War II, or the Great War, as some people call it, or the war to end all wars, depending on whose perspective you have, changes, doesn't it? Now the US's version, the version that was taught in the US history books growing up, is that we were kind of the lead dog for the Allies. We were the big guys. Well, imagine the Russian point of view. They lost 26 million men. And mostly the way they did it was by making human target practice for the Germans and keeping them occupied for a long period of time, so that the Allies, led by the United States and Britain, could regroup and fight back. Without the Russian contribution, we would have lost the war easily. The Allies would have. But they did it in a different way than the US did. The US's perspective is we brought in radar, sonar, fighting machines, the mini sub. We brought in all kinds of technology. Russia simply brought manpower. Literally, for every man or woman that the United States lost in combat, the Russians lost 1,000. 1,000, that's a staggering comparison. We lost 250,000, they lost 26 million. They get a completely different perspective about what's possible based on that. That changed their birth statistics for a whole generation, because you can't lose 26 million people out of a population of 200 million and not change the birth certificates. All of a sudden there's a huge shortage of males in the population after World War II. Like, all kinds of crazy stuff. But their history or their story limits what's possible. Their story is about suffering and sacrifice. Ours is about victory and sacrifice. Oh, interesting. We both won the war on the same side. Theirs is all about suffering, ours is all about victory. And you and I do that too. How does it affect us? That's the big question. So, I'll tell you my personal story growing up. No, not surprisingly, you know, my last name is Hittler, and it's spelled with 2 T's. It's Hittler, and that makes zero difference in the abuse that I took as a kid. Because 4th graders don't ask you the spelling of your name. They don't care that you're not related to the infamous one. They don't care that his last name was never Hitler and he changed it in prison in the early 30s as part of his master plan. They don't ask any of that, nor do they understand any of it. They don't care. Now, I'm convinced that God's got a sense of humor. I grew up in suburban Detroit. Good place to be from. Glad I'm not there now. But we grew up, I was born in the 60s, and there were race riots. They burned the city down in 1968. Detroit had race riots. LA had, Watts had them as well. But they burned the city down, and anybody who still lived in the city of Detroit after the race riots fled to the suburbs. Now, suburbs essentially equaled clean white living. It was white people living in the suburbs. That's where you went. If you were still around in the Detroit area, you moved to the suburbs because they were safer and they were white. That's the reality. Well, we grew up in a suburb one small notch north of middle class. We were not working class, but we were not upper crust, that's for sure. There were upper crust suburbs, we were not part of it. We were part of an Irish Catholic enclave. We went to a Catholic parochial school and the whole deal. But in the late 60s, there was the onset of the non-discrimination in housing. All those laws started coming about in the late 60s. You couldn't discriminate in housing. So who moved into our new neighborhood? But primarily Jewish residents. This is where God has a sense of humor. So there's the Hitler family in a heavily sprinkled population of Jewish families. God does have a sense of humor, doesn't he? So that's where we grew up. You didn't just move and say, sorry, you moved to the wrong neighborhood by luck or circumstance or God's odd sense of humor. You just put up with it. So we grew up in a heavily Jewish neighborhood. Well, imagine what that meant for us growing up with kids who only one generation earlier had relatives killed in concentration camps. Not good. Really not good. Like dangerously bad for a kid like me and my siblings. Because there were kids who wanted to take out that punishment on us personally as if we were personally responsible. Of course we weren't. We didn't understand their anger. They didn't understand that we had nothing to do with it. And what ensued was usually physical threats and violence for us. And we just grew up with it. That was just normal. Now, if you remember in those days as well, there were the white pages. So the white pages came out every year. They put the yellow pages on your front porch, but also there were the white pages. And in the white pages, there was nobody that opted out or had an unlisted number. Everybody, name, address, and phone number was in the news or in the white pages. So of course you go to last name, Hitler, Daniel, my dad's last name. Our address, 18053 Saratoga Avenue in Lathrop Village, Michigan, followed by our home phone number, 313-559-0158. That's it. That was our home phone number growing up. Guess who called our house when you were 7 or 8 years old on a Friday night? Drunken teenagers making crank calls that were expressly violent and crude. When you're a 7 or 8-year-old kid, you don't understand that. It's frightening. And of course my parents didn't talk to them. They just saw the look on our face when we answered the phone and a kid made a crank call in a threatening way, or when they threw something on our porch or broke a window at our house because they knew our home address. My parents tried to normalize it as best they could, and for us that was our version of normal growing up. We didn't know any different because that's what happened. But it was odd, and it affected how you grew up. Okay, there was that. Then when you got old enough, like 8 or 9, there was physical violence. Kids wanted to take you out. And it was because they had anger culturally, and their family had specific relatives who were killed in concentration camps. I completely understood that, sort of, as best a 9-year-old could, but I also understood it had nothing to do with me. And you can imagine the type of threats of violence. This was my story growing up, because this is how we were raised. I'd be riding my bike home with my buddy from playing baseball or playing touch football or whatever, or just riding home from school, and it was never a kid in my grade who was my age and my size picking a fight. That would have been fine. That happens. It was always kids who were 2 years older, 2 grade levels higher, 10 pounds heavier, or maybe 20 pounds heavier, and there were 4 of them and there were 2 of us. Or there were 5 of them and there were 3 of us. Always we were outnumbered, because they weren't going to bully us or pick a fight unless they could inflict the punishment they wanted. That was the ecosystem we grew up in. It was never a one-on-one fight. Oh, well, you can imagine how much fun it was to ride your bike home when that would happen. You couldn't outride it, people. You had a bike, they had a bike. Or you had a bike and they had a car. You weren't going to outrun them. You weren't going to outride them. So eventually you're going to have to deal with it. And the altercations that ensued were oftentimes violent. Sometimes in my favor, sometimes in theirs, but almost always there was violence that ensued. Now tack onto that, my mom was wise enough to have a no fighting policy, because she knew that the background, or the neighborhood we lived in, was going to be dangerous if we were fighters. If we got the reputation of fighting every kid that wanted to pick on us, we would have been in a fight every day. And she was right. So it didn't mean that we didn't fight. It meant that you had to fight cleanly enough that you couldn't come home with a black eye. Because if you came home with a black eye, she knew you were in a fight, and that was not allowed. Then you were grounded or punished further. All of this was part of my story. This was a story I had growing up, and I was resentful for it. Resented my parents, and as kids, I was one of 9, and it was kind of a kid a year, Irish Catholic, remember. Our pleading with my parents was to change our last name. That would just solve the problem. They were smart enough to realize changing a last name when everybody already knew what it was wouldn't have helped. And they were Irish Catholic stubborn, and there's German in there too, obviously, with the Hittler. They weren't going to do it. So we got what we got. That was just our ecosystem, or our story, or the result of our upbringing growing up. My guess is you got this kind of adversity in your life too. It just looks different. It's personalized to you. Well, mine included fights, which of course were not allowed, so physical violence. Think about baseball. I mean, everybody played Little League Baseball when I was a kid. We also played football and basketball and all that stuff too. But in Little League Baseball, I led the league like 5 years in a row in being hit by the pitcher. I didn't understand it as a 10-year-old that the reason I was hit by a pitcher was there was enough kids on that team that wanted to throw the ball right at my head, and the dads, of course, secretly condoned it, so when I got up, they would throw right at me. I didn't understand why the pitcher could throw strikes all day long, and then when I got up there, he'd hit me right in the small of the back. Just didn't understand it. Now, my parents must have known. They didn't tell me. Years later, you'd put it all together and say, that's why I was that's why I was hit by a pitch 4 times as often as the next closest kid in the whole league. And that was like 5 years running, because they were throwing at me on purpose. Because my last name. Crazy. But that's the way it was. So, too bad. Well, the vandalism, the crank calls, it was all scary growing up as a kid. And that was my story. That's the story I grew up with, and that's the victimization, or the adversity that I walked around with. That was my cross to bear, if you will. Well, years later, and even in the moment, some of it I kind of recognized. But there were things that were advantages. It wasn't all bad. I mean, it was generally bad. But as a kid, a little kid, I had developed a hierarchy of values that I would have never developed had it not been for the adversity. Like, I knew when to run, I knew when to fight, I knew when to stand my ground, what I would stand up for, whom I would stand up for, what I would fight for. I knew what was right, I knew what was wrong in a way that you can't get without that level of adversity. Well, gosh, that was kind of an advantage. Now, it was born out of dire circumstances, but it turned out to be an advantage. Who knew? Well, I had to allow it. It wasn't possible because I wasn't allowing it. Imagine being my best friend. I had an experience of friendship growing up that other kids didn't. Because if you were my best friend, and we were riding home from a pickup basketball game at somebody's house, and we were riding home for dinner, and we're riding together, and 4 bullies come up who are 2 years older than us, if you're my best friend, guess who's the second guy in the fight? Now, you didn't have to fight. I never required that any of my friends fight. Every best friend I had a couple that were really close, every one of them said, I got your back. Now, that sometimes meant they got beat up too. Because if they tried to defend me or somehow prevent the fight, that just meant that they were on my team and they were going to get pounded too. Could you imagine the lessons I learned about loyalty and friendship from having a best friend that other people just would not? They wouldn't have that because there was no implicit or explicit violence that was prevalent in our neighborhood. My best friends were incredibly loyal, and I learned that loyalty as well, and I was grateful for it because it meant it was 4-on-2 instead of 4-on-1. 4-on-2 we could actually win. We knew how to win. I had to fight every day. I knew how to do it. So did my best friends, but they had to be willing to pay that price and risk getting pounded. Wow, what did I learn about friendship from that? Amazing what you learn as a 10-year-old that I would have never learned without that adversity. But my story was not including that until a later age. I didn't realize that that was all an advantage. Jeez. Well, so I did learn. I learned a hierarchy of values. I learned when to run, when to negotiate. And like most abuse victims, and we have a lot of clients who have a history of abuse, we work with them to transform that. I developed a 6th sense around danger. Who do you trust intuitively? Who do you watch out for? Who do you keep your eye on at all times? Who's got the quick trigger and temper? Who's more reasonable and you can talk? You learned that in a non-verbal way. You could sense that about people intuitively. We learn that by being around danger. Abuse victims, I find, all have a heightened sense of awareness that's an incredible advantage if they'll use it. Well, I had the same thing. It was born out of different circumstances. I wasn't abused at home, but there was violence and danger around me growing up. So you learn that. What an amazing advantage when you're in business. You intuitively get a sense of who to trust and who not to trust. Not because they're physically dangerous, but because they don't have your good intentions at heart. Incredible value and incredibly valuable moving forward. If I were willing to use it. Well, maybe you're in the same boat. It didn't dawn on me until I was a young adult, until I graduated from college and actually started a business. I started a business right out of college. I didn't work for anybody else. I started my own business and I realized that, oh, gosh, I was succeeding in a way that seemed too easy. And part of what I noticed is these people aren't very tough. They're not willing to stand up for what they want. They're not willing to work hard. They're not willing to fight for, literally use the, there was language around the word, like fighting for what you want. I was willing to fight for what I want. I was willing to fight to succeed, and mentally I was a lot tougher. Now physically I may have been tougher. It didn't help very much in a service business. But mentally I was a lot tougher for having gone through the experiences as a kid. What an advantage. I just never dawned on me that this might actually pay off. What a great thing. I had a limited tolerance for BS. I'd gotten that at 8 or 9 years old. I didn't learn that from a Harvard Business Review article or because I took a graduate level class. I learned that intuitively and instinctively in a way that's much more useful and human by having to defend myself. Well, I also developed an empathy for people who have had tough circumstances if and only if they were willing to move forward. Because I wasn't willing to complain too much about my circumstances, but for people who had a tough upbringing and said, you know what, I'm okay, I'm going to keep going forward, I was their partner. For people that wanted to complain all day, I just no empathy, no tolerance, no sympathy, just didn't want to be around them. I didn't like that victimization thing. Well, I realized I wasn't much of a victim either. I was moving on. That was much more my style. I learned all that at 8 or 9 or 12. Fabulous. Just never acknowledged it or never put it to work for me. Well, how about you? What's the story you've been carrying around that's old? that's broken, that's limiting your possibilities. I was doing the same thing until I realized the same story that could have me limited or broken or ineffective has the same qualities that are strengths or character traits or advantages in life. Oh, I just had to turn that on. You willing to do it? Well, really all it means, all it takes is to reposition the exact same circumstances that you may be resentful or hurtful or compromised by, and reposition them as the advantages that you have that other people simply could not have experienced because they didn't share your background. That simple? Very much so. Now, is it easy? No. Here's the way I've put it with my siblings. I now realize it's great to be Hitler. It really is. Imagine my advantage now when I go to a function of any sort. It could be a barbecue, it could be a business function, and I meet people and introduce myself to them. You think any of them don't remember my name when they walk out of there? You think I'm hard to Google afterwards? Even if they don't have my card, which I rarely bring with me because I just think it's unnecessary, every one of them Googles me if they want to and can find me really easily. Because there's not too many Hitlers in the world. Certainly not many in my business or my service category, and not many that are 6'5" and redheaded. I'm easy to Google because of my last name. Incredible advantage. Wow, it's great to be Hitler. And I kid with my siblings because those of us, of the 9 of us that have realized it and put it to work, we recognize the power and the advantage we have. Now, is it comparable, or is it a counterbalance to the price we paid? I would say yes. It's just easier that way to say, for all this time we got our butt kicked, unfairly and unnecessarily, we're getting the corresponding advantage on the other side. Fair enough. So we paid the price early, now let's put it to work. My guess is you've paid the price for your story. Now I would claim there's a corresponding value as well. Let's go capture it. You want to figure that out? Here's how we do it. It's very, very simple, and you have to be willing to play. Step 1, I would do this as if you were doing it about someone else. Even though you're doing it about yourself, you have to hold it as if it's someone else's story. But I would imagine or retell the exact same story that you've had your entire life as the key to your success to date. So you say, everything I went through as a kid, gosh, that was actually my key. Every success I've had up until today, this moment, is due to that story that I've held my whole life. Oh, that's different, because you've been saying it's so unfair, or you don't understand I was abused, or you don't understand my parents were divorced, or you don't understand I grew up with in a tough neighbor. Yeah, I do. Actually retell or reposition the story as the key components to your success up to this very moment. Oh. Now that's like a mental exercise. You have to allow yourself to do that, because your body won't want to do that. Your head can, your body won't. Your body will say it's not fair. Okay, that's step 1. Step 2, list, like make a list of what did you learn, what character traits did you develop as part of it, what advantages did you hone or perfect as part of that. And I literally mean the word perfect. You are a master at certain character traits because of the adversity you had to take younger in life. Oh, let's put it to work. You've already paid the price for it. Let's put it to work. So that's number 2. List what you've learned, what character traits or what skills you've perfected as a result of your adversity earlier in life. Step 2. Step 3, give active gratitude for what you learned, the character traits, and the skills that you perfected. Oh, now you're fighting. That's unfair. Don't make me give gratitude for it, because you don't understand. My dad was abusive. He was an alcoholic and physically abusive. And you go, yep. And you have incredible advantages in your life because of it. What? It's not fair that I would. It isn't fair that you were. But you know what? You've already paid for the gift. Now capture it. Now capture the full value of it, because it already happened. We're simply repositioning your story or transforming your story to make it safer and more attractive. That's what we do every day. We create lasting behavior change by making transformation safer and more attractive. That's all we're going to do. We're going to transform your story, make it safer. We're going to mine for what's safe, and we're going to mine for what's attractive in your story. You've already paid the price. Let's capture the gift in it. So that's the third thing. Give active gratitude for everything that you've achieved up until today, utilizing that which you learned from your adversity. Wow. Okay, now what? There's more? Yeah, there's more. 2 more steps. Now, again, you're going to have to imagine or retell. This is like a creative writing. I would retell it, and then I would rewrite it. Writing it in handwriting, not on a computer. You can do it on a computer, but it's better if you handwrite it like in a journal. Create or imagine your story moving forward from this moment forward, telling of your future success in life, utilizing that same list of advantages, character traits, and what you learned from your adversity growing up. Truth is, you've got all that. Put it to use for it. It's simply like the World War II people. It's retelling their story in a way that's useful, rather than in a way that's debilitating or victimizing. Victimization doesn't get you very far. It has people pity you. It has you be less than all of who you can be. Empowering you has you tell a story of possibility. You're going to open up possibilities that simply weren't present in the way you were telling your story previously. So imagine and retell your story from here forward into the future, dependent upon or built upon those character traits, that which you learned, and the skills that you honed and perfected earlier in life. Oh, gosh darn it. Yep, I told you, simple. It's not that easy. And the last step, step 5. Again, give active gratitude for the future success you will have using those skills. You're again giving gratitude for the learning, the character traits, and the skills that you perfected and honed under adversity. Wow. Is that enough? Simple, not easy. Now here's the thing. When you do this, you will open up possibilities that simply did not exist in your old story. You had an old story that's not very powerful. It's not very helpful. It keeps you stuck in yesterday. You're creating a new story. You're transforming the same story you had into something that's filled with possibility and success instead of something that limits possibilities. Incredibly transformative. And when you do this, you unlock what I call the beauty and power within. You'll step into your full beauty and power. Every person has that. It's part of being human. You have it's an equal measure of beauty and power, and you'll step right into that when you retell your story. Are you willing to do it? It's the only question that remains. So here's the thing. If this is hard, ask for help. I'm happy to help you. Like I said, I'm empathetic and action-oriented for people that want to move forward. I have zero tolerance for people that want to stay in their story of victimization. It's just not very interesting. Nobody wants to hear it because we've heard it all before. So that's the first thing. If you need help, let me know, and I'm happy to walk alongside you. Secondly, my hat's off to you, because this is the choice to play full out in what I call a transformed life. And when you do that, you get all the benefits and all the beauty and power and all the success, because you literally create it. You transform it and you create it. So my hat's off to you for playing with the courage and vulnerability to live what I call a transformed life. It's not for everyone. Until we meet again on Pure Genius, all the best.